St. Louis, 1810. A man named John Colter walks in out of the West, and within a single season his name has become a joke so good it will outlive him by more than 50 years, and the town knows exactly who he is. That is what makes it strange. 4 years earlier, John Colter had been one of the most trusted men on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Not a passenger, not a name on a roster. He was a hunter, one of the small handful recruited out of Kentucky at the very beginning, and he was the man they sent out ahead, alone, when something needed finding. He walked the whole continent with them and back. He's in the journals over and over, doing the hard, unglamorous, dangerous work that kept 40 men alive. And then, on the way home, he disappeared into the mountains and did not come out for 4 years. Now he is standing in St. Louis, and he is telling people what he found up there. He says there is ground in those mountains that is hot in the middle of winter. He says the snow will not lie on it, that it melts back in a ring and leaves the earth bare and steaming in January. He says there is mud that boils by itself, out of the ground, with no fire underneath it. He says there are pools of water so clear you can see down into them further than seems reasonable, and they are scalding. And he says that without warning, water comes out of solid rock under enormous pressure and stands up in the air higher than a house, roaring, white, taller than anything around it, and then falls back, and the ground swallows it, and sometime later it does the whole thing again. Nobody believes him, not one person, not the traders, not the boatmen, not the men he served with. They laugh at him, and they keep laughing for years, and eventually they give the place a name so that the laughing has something to attach to. They call it Colter's Hell, the country that does not exist, the Tall Tale, the place that poor lunatic swears he walked through. Now. Before I tell you the next part, I want you to hold in your head how completely alone he is in this. Every single person who hears him says no. There is no witness. There is no evidence. There is one man with a story and a room full of people who have decided he is lying, and that situation does not change for the rest of his life. He was right about every part of it. The hot ground, the boiling mud, the water standing up out of the rock, every detail. It would take the United States 64 years to admit it, and by then he'd been dead for 59 of them, buried in a grave that nobody today can find. And when the country finally sent people back to look, it decided that the ground John Colter had been mocked for describing was so extraordinary that it must never be touched by anyone, ever. They made it the first national park on Earth. You know it as Yellowstone, but here is the thing. That is not why we are here tonight, because the mockery is not the mystery. The mystery starts 4 years earlier on a boat. August 1806. The Lewis and Clark expedition is going home. 2.5 years, 8,000 miles. Colter has starved on that journey and frozen on it and buried a man on it, and now the current is finally running the right way. Downstream, toward St. Louis, toward beds and bread and the end of it. 60 days. That is the entire distance between him and everything he's been thinking about for 900 days. And 2 ragged trappers come up the river going the other way. John Colter watches them pass, and then he walks up to his captains and asks them to let him off the boat. He wants to turn around. He wants to go back up. Not a shortcut home. The opposite of home. He's asking permission to throw away a homecoming he has already paid for in blood and walk 2,000 miles back into the country that has spent 30 months trying to kill him. With 2 men he met the day before yesterday. No wages, no supply line, nobody coming to look for him. They let him go. They write it down. They hand him powder and lead. The boats push out into the current and the gap opens. 50 yards, 200, a bend in the river. And then the sound of them is gone, and John Colter is standing alone on a riverbank in the middle of North America. He is 32 years old. And here is what the next 4 years are going to do to him. He will walk 500 miles by himself through a Rocky Mountain winter, on foot, carrying 30 pounds, with no map, because no map of that country exists. He will find people nobody has told him how to find. He will come down out of a pass in the snow and look up at mountains that rise 7,000 feet straight out of flat ground with no warning at all. He will stand on crust 2 inches thick with boiling water underneath it and have no idea. He will lose his partner on a river at first light. He will be stripped naked in front of several hundred men and told to run. He will run 6 miles barefoot across stone and cactus with his nose streaming blood. And then, halfway across that plain, he will stop and turn around and do something that nobody chasing him expects. He will walk 200 miles afterwards with no clothes, no shoes, no weapon, and no food in 11 days. And then, and this is the part that nobody has ever been able to explain, he will go back. Not once. 5 separate times. 5 times over 4 years he's handed a clear road home, and 5 times he turns around and walks into that country again, each time knowing more than the last about exactly how it is likely to end. And he never says why. Not in a letter. Not to the 2 men who sat with him and pulled the entire story of that run out of him in detail. Not to his captain. Not to his wife. He leaves no journal. He leaves no portrait. Nobody knows what his face looked like. He leaves a single line drawn on another man's map from memory, which nobody in 200 years has managed to retrace. Tonight, we're going to find out what he saw, and by the end, I want you to sit with the question that no historian has ever been able to answer, because he never explained it to anybody, not once, in writing or out loud. Why did he get off the boat? Before we continue, tell me where you're listening from. Leave a comment with your town or country and the local time where you are. I read every single comment and I love seeing listeners from all over the world. Now, some corrections, because this man has collected more legend than almost anyone in American history, and the true version is better. You may have heard that Colter discovered Yellowstone. That is close, and it is not quite right. He was almost certainly the first person of European descent to walk into that country and come back out able to describe it. But the nickname Colter's Hell was never attached to the place we now call Yellowstone National Park. It was attached to a smaller, angrier patch of thermal ground on the Shoshone River, near present-day Cody, Wyoming. The two got tangled together in the retelling over a century, and now everyone repeats it. I am going to keep them apart tonight, because the real geography is stranger than the mashed-together version. You may have heard about the Colter Stone, a chunk of rhyolite found in an Idaho field in 1931, carved with the name John Colter and the year 1808. It is a wonderful object. It is also almost certainly not what people wanted it to be. No serious historian treats it as evidence. We will look at it later and I will tell you exactly why it is a problem. And you may have heard about the Run, the Naked Run, the most famous escape in the history of the American frontier. That happened. But it comes to us the way almost everything about Colter comes to us. Second-hand. Told by other men who heard him tell it. Written down years afterward. Colter himself left us almost nothing. No journal, no memoir, a signature, a few business records, one map drawn from memory, and silence. That silence is going to matter enormously by the end of tonight. Keep it somewhere in the back of your mind. Here is where we are going. We will start with a young man from Virginia who took a job in 1803 and turned out to be very good at a very specific thing. We will stand on the riverbank in August 1806 and watch a boat pull away without him. We will spend a winter with two men who wanted to get rich and could not stand each other. Then we will do the walk. The real one. Alone in winter. 500 miles, carrying a 30-pound pack through country no one had mapped, with instructions to find people who had no idea he was coming. We will stand where he stood when the ground started to steam. We will find out what happened when he came home and opened his mouth. We will run, and this is the part everyone knows, and it is worse than you have been told, and better. And then we will get to the thing I cannot explain, and neither can anybody else. Because after all of it, after everything, he went back. Let us start with the job. In October 1803, a boat came down the Ohio River carrying an army captain who was recruiting. Meriwether Lewis was looking for a very particular kind of man. Not soldiers exactly. He could get soldiers. He wanted men who could shoot, walk, carry and survive, and who would not fall apart 3 months from the nearest fort. He recruited a handful of them out of Kentucky, and they are remembered in the records by an unglamorous name, the 9 young men from Kentucky. John Colter was one of them. He was about 29, born in Virginia, raised in Kentucky, which in that decade meant raised on the edge of everything. He enlisted at Maysville for $5 a month. We know embarrassingly little about who he was before that day. No portrait exists. No description of his face has survived that anyone can rely on. We have a scattering of accounts calling him quiet, and one calling him about 5'10" with a frame built for walking, and that is close to everything. Which is its own kind of fact and worth holding on to. This is a man whose entire visible life is the 4 years in the middle. Before it, almost nothing. After it, almost nothing. He arrives out of the dark, does something extraordinary, and goes back into the dark. On the expedition, he was a hunter. That word does not carry enough weight, so let me unpack it. 40-odd men eating in the field need somewhere in the region of 8 or 9 pounds of meat each, every day when there is nothing else. That is hundreds of pounds a day. It does not come from the boats. It comes from men who leave the party before dawn, go out ahead alone or in pairs, kill something large, butcher it where it falls, and get it back to a moving camp that has changed position since they left. That was the job. Out ahead, alone, every day. Find the game, find the camp again. Do not get lost, do not get killed. Come back with 200 pounds on your shoulders, and it is lonely work by design. The party is loud. 40 men, boats, horses, cooking, argument. Game does not come near that. So the hunter's whole craft is to get away from his own people early, get well out ahead or well off to the side, and be somewhere quiet by first light. Which means that for most of 2.5 years, while everyone else in that expedition was living in a crowd, Colter's ordinary working day was silence. Colter was, by the record of the journals, one of the 2 or 3 best they had at it. His name appears again and again in the entries, sent ahead, sent out, sent back to look for a lost horse, sent up a side creek to see what is there. When something needed to be found, he was one of the men they sent, and here is the detail that explains everything that comes later. He spent 2.5 years being paid to walk into unknown country by himself and come back, not to march in a column, not to hold a line, to go out alone, past the edge of what anyone knew was there, look at it, and return. day after day for 900 days. By the end of it, that had stopped being a job and turned into something closer to a shape of mind. He was not a soldier who happened to go into the wilderness. He was a man who had been trained, slowly and completely, to be comfortable in the one situation that makes almost every human being frightened. Alone, far out, no help coming. He got in trouble too. Early on, before the expedition even left, he was court-martialed for going absent without leave and behaving badly toward an officer. He pleaded guilty. He was pardoned on the condition he behave. He behaved, and then he became indispensable. The journals record him doing hard, unremarkable, dangerous things for 2.5 years without ever becoming a character. He is a name that appears when work needs doing. Then, in the summer of 1806 on the way home, that name does something that has puzzled people ever since. August 1806. The Mandan villages on the upper Missouri in what is now North Dakota. The expedition is coming down the river fast. Downstream travel after 2 years of dragging boats upstream is a different animal entirely. The current does the work. The miles come easy, and every hour puts them closer to home. Morale, by every account, is enormous. They have been given up for dead back east. They are about to walk into St. Louis like ghosts and be astonished at their own survival. Into this comes a canoe going the other way. 2 men, Forrest Hancock and Joseph Dixon, trappers out of Illinois, headed up into the Yellowstone country to take beaver, which is at that moment one of the most valuable commodities on earth, because Europe has decided that gentlemen's hats will be made of felted beaver fur and nothing else. They stop, they talk, they want information, where the beaver are, where the water runs, who lives where. The expedition has exactly that information and nobody else on the continent does, and they want something else. They want a man who has been there. Colter said yes. We do not know how long he thought about it. We do not know whether it took an hour or a week or a heartbeat. What we know is that he went to Lewis and Clark and asked to be discharged 2 months early at the far edge of nowhere to go back the way he had come. Clark wrote it down. The captains agreed on one condition, that no one else ask. They could not have the party unravel this close to the end. The men were consulted. Nobody else wanted to go. Of course nobody else wanted to go. They gave him powder and lead, and what supplies could be spared, and they wrote him a good discharge, and they cast off. Now put yourself on that riverbank for a second, because this is the image the whole night hangs from. He is standing on the shore. Everyone he has known intimately for 900 days, the men he starved with, the men who hauled him out of rivers, the captains who trusted him, are in boats moving away from him on a fast current. The gap opens 50 yards, 200, a bend in the river, and then they are gone, and it is quiet, and he is alone in the middle of North America with 2 men he met the day before yesterday. He was 32 years old. Everyone else went home to be famous. There were newspapers waiting. There was a dinner in Washington. There were land grants and double pay, and for some of them, careers. Colter got none of it, because he was not there. So why? I want to be honest with you here, because this is the exact spot where a lot of storytellers reach for something comfortable, and I am not going to. We do not know. He never said. Not in any surviving letter, not in any account passed down by the men who knew him, not in any of the testimony collected by the people who later wrote about him. The single, most consequential decision of his life is a blank space in the record. What we have instead are guesses, and they are worth laying out because each one tells you something different about him. Money is the obvious one. Beaver pelts were worth real money, and he knew the ground better than any living white man. Except that Hancock and Dixon had no capital, no organization, no license, and the partnership collapsed within months, and Colter came out of it with nothing. If it was money, he was uncharacteristically bad at it. Restlessness is the romantic one, and it is the one the legends prefer, the man who could not bear a settled life. There is probably something in it. But it does not explain the specific choice, because restlessness could have taken him anywhere, and he chose to go back to the one place that had nearly killed him. And the third one is the one I find myself thinking about, though it is speculation, and I am labelling it as such, that after 2.5 years of being the man who walks out ahead alone, going home meant becoming somebody ordinary again, somebody who sleeps in a room, and that when the choice arrived on a riverbank in a canoe, the ordinary version of his life did not stand a chance. I cannot prove that. Nobody can. It is a guess about the inside of a man who left no record of his interior at all. But whatever the reason was, it was strong enough to survive contact with reality, because within a year he would do the same thing again under far worse conditions, and then again after that, and by then the reason had stopped being a mystery of one moment and become the organizing principle of his entire remaining life. The boat rounded the bend. The first thing that happened to him afterwards was a disappointment. The partnership with Hancock and Dixon lasted about as long as most partnerships formed on impulse by desperate men. They went up into the Yellowstone country. They trapped. And somewhere over that winter the three of them fell out, over the take or the direction, or simply the impossible strain of 3 men in a small camp in deep cold, with nothing to do at night but be irritated by each other. The details are lost. What we have is the outcome. They split. Hancock and Dixon went their way. Colter went his. And in the spring of 1807, he did something that ought to make you sit up. He got in a canoe, alone, and started down the Missouri. Going home. Finally, a year late, doing the sensible thing. He came all the way down, hundreds of miles of it. He got as far as the mouth of the Platte, which is close enough to civilization that you can feel it. That is Nebraska. That is inhabited country. That is a few weeks from St. Louis. And he ran into another boat coming up. It was a big one this time, not 2 ragged trappers with a canoe. This was Manuel Lisa, a Spanish-born St. Louis-based merchant with capital, ambition, and a crew of about 50 men, including several of Colter's old comrades from the expedition, heading up into exactly the country Colter had just spent a year in. Lisa wanted him. Obviously, Lisa wanted him. Colter was, at that precise moment, the single most useful man in North America for what Lisa was attempting. Colter turned the canoe around. Twice now. Twice he's been within reach of home and turned back. The first time, 60 days out. The second time, close enough to smell it. The first time you can call it impulse. The second time it is a pattern, and the pattern is the man. I want to stay with this for a moment, because it is going to matter later, and I do not want it to slide past. There is a version of this story where Colter is a wanderer, a wild man, someone who simply cannot be indoors. That version is easy, and it is not quite right either. Because at the end of all this, and we will get there, he does go home. He marries, he buys land, he has a son. He becomes, briefly, a man with a farm. So it is not that he was incapable of it. It is that for 4 years, whenever the choice was put in front of him, Something in him picked the other thing, and he never once wrote down what that something was. He went back up the river with Lisa, and at the mouth of the Bighorn where it runs into the Yellowstone, they stopped and built a fort out of logs and called it Fort Raymond. It was a trading post, and the whole idea depended on one thing that had not happened yet. Somebody had to go out and tell the nations of that country that the post existed. Somebody had to walk out into a winter mountain range, find people who did not know he was coming, and invite them to trade. Lisa had 50 men. He sent one. Understand what Fort Raymond was, because it changes how the next part reads. It was not a fort in the military sense. It was a rectangle of cottonwood logs with a couple of rooms and a stockade, sitting at a river junction hundreds of miles from any other structure built by anybody like the men inside it. Its entire business model was this. The nations of the region, the Crow, the Flathead, the Shoshone and others, would bring beaver pelts, and Lisa would exchange them for cloth, kettles, powder, tobacco, knives, and beads. Everyone would profit, and Lisa would take the pelts down to St. Louis and get rich. The flaw in the plan is obvious the moment you say it out loud. None of those nations knew the post was there. They had their own trade networks, centuries old, running in every direction across that country. They had established relationships and established rivals. A new log building on a river junction meant nothing to them unless somebody physically came and said so. So the post needed a messenger. And the messenger's job description was, when you write it out plainly, close to insane. Leave in late autumn. Go alone. Carry a pack of about 30 pounds. Trade samples to prove you are serious. A rifle, powder, lead, a blanket, and all, a little food. Walk into a mountain range in winter. Find scattered bands of people whose exact locations nobody at the fort knows, who move seasonally, and who have no reason to expect you or trust you. Explain without a shared language that there is now a place where they can trade. Then come back. Distance unknown, duration unknown, route unknown, because it has not been mapped, and no way to send word. That is the piece that has no modern equivalent at all. If he was 3 months late, nobody at the fort would know whether that meant he was 3 months late or dead in November under 4 feet of snow, and there would be no way to find out ever. Men simply did not come back sometimes, and the record of it was a name that stopped appearing. So when Lisa handed him that assignment, both of them understood the terms exactly. There was no misunderstanding to be had. Lisa gave that job to John Colter. There is no record of Colter hesitating. One more thing before he goes, because it reframes the whole walk. He was not being sent somewhere to find out what was there. Lisa did not care what was there. Lisa cared about pelts and customers. The geography was incidental. It was the ground you crossed to reach the meeting, which means the single greatest journey of exploration in that generation happened as a side effect of a sales trip. Nobody commissioned it. Nobody funded it as discovery. There was no scientific instruction, no order to record anything, no expectation that he would come back with knowledge rather than trade agreements. That is why there is no journal. Nobody asked him for one. He went out in the late autumn of 1807, on foot by himself, and he was gone through the winter, and when he came back in the spring of 1808 he had walked, by the most careful modern reconstructions, something in the region of 500 miles. 500 miles, alone, in winter, in the Rocky Mountains, on foot. I want that number to sit with you tonight, because it is going to come back. That figure is not folklore, and it is not a boast. It comes from tracing the geography he described afterwards, and it is, if anything, a conservative estimate. Some historians put it higher. Nobody accompanied him. Nobody corroborated it in real time. He walked out of a log fort into snow, and 4 or 5 months later he walked back in, and everything we know about what happened in between comes from what he said afterwards and from one map. That is the walk we're about to take. But first I need you to understand what winter means up there, because I think most of us have a domesticated idea of cold, and this was not that. Picture the country. The Bighorn Basin, the Wind River Range, the Upper Yellowstone, the Absarokas, the Tetons, elevations that start high and go higher. Much of that walking is done between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. Air thin enough that a heavy pack takes something out of you that it would not take at sea level. In winter, temperatures in that country regularly sit at 20 and 30 below. In the bad stretches they go lower. Snow in the passes comes in feet, not inches, and it does not melt out until May or June. Rivers that are crossable in August are either roaring under ice or frozen unevenly enough that you cannot know from the surface whether it will hold you. Now take away everything. No map. Nobody had drawn one. No trail except the game trails and the paths of nations who knew where they were going and had not left signage for a stranger. No tent. No stove. No sleeping bag. No matches. Fire comes from flint and steel and dry tinder you have kept dry inside your shirt. No rescue, no signal, no relief column, no painkillers, no antibiotics, and no other human being for weeks at a time. Think about what a small accident becomes in that situation. A twisted ankle on scree at 8,000 feet is not an injury, it is a sentence, because you cannot get anywhere and nothing is coming for you. Wet clothes going into a night at 20 below is not discomfort. It is the end. A rifle that will not fire when a bear stands up out of the willows is not bad luck. It is the last thing that ever happens to you. He walked into that in about November and did not come out until spring. And here is the thing that most accounts skip over, and it is the part I find most impressive. It was not a survival ordeal. It was a business trip. He was not lost. He was not fleeing. He was not stranded. He had a task list. He was navigating deliberately on a route he was inventing as he went in order to hold meetings. There is a thing about walking that far that people who have not done it tend to miss, and it is worth a moment because it changes how you picture him. At that distance, walking stops being exercise and becomes a job you clock into. You're not striding. You're not admiring anything. You're managing a body that is slowly falling apart and negotiating with it every morning about whether it is going to cooperate today. Your feet are the whole world. Everything routes through them. Wet feet in cold country crack and split, and once they split they do not close, because you are on them again in 6 hours. A blister is not an annoyance out there. A blister that opens and gets dirty at 8,000 feet, with no way to clean it, is the beginning of a problem that can take a leg or a life. Your pack does not get lighter, it gets heavier every single day, in the way that only a pack can. You're hungry in a way that stops being a feeling and becomes a background hum. On a long winter walk in that country, a man burns something in the order of 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day, and there is no arrangement by which he reliably takes in 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day. So the body starts eating itself quietly, week after week, and the man gets colder and slower and more stupid, and has to make navigational decisions with a brain that is being starved. And on top of all of that, layered over every hour of it, is the arithmetic that never switches off. How far to water? How far to timber? How many hours of light are left? Is that weather building or passing? And the one that never stops running. If something happens right now, what do I do? There is no answer to that last one. That is what makes it different. On any other kind of hard journey, the answer is get help. Out there, the honest answer is nothing. You do not do anything. You handle it or you do not. He carried that calculation for 4 or 5 months without setting it down. He found people. That was the job and he did it. He walked into camps of the Crow and other bands as a lone stranger, which incidentally is the only way that meeting could possibly have gone well. A single, unarmed-looking man on foot in winter is not a threat and is not a war party. He was physically the message. Whoever sent me is not coming to take anything. He got fed. He got sheltered. He got taken in more than once by people who had every reason to be suspicious of him and were not. He would not have survived a week otherwise, and he knew it. And every serious account of that winter acknowledges it. That is the unglamorous, load-bearing truth underneath the whole legend of the lone mountain man. He was not alone. He survived because other people let him, and somewhere in the middle of that circuit, the exact point is one of the things we cannot pin down, he walked into a place that stopped him. Before the steam, there was the wall. Somewhere on that winter loop moving west out of the Wind River country, Colter crossed a pass and came down into a long flat valley with a river running through it, and on the far side of that valley, straight up out of the flat ground with no foothills, no warning, no gentle build, stood a row of mountains. The Tetons. If you've never seen them, they are difficult to describe without sounding like you're exaggerating, so let me be technical instead. Most mountain ranges announce themselves. The land rises, then rises more, then becomes hills, then becomes mountains, and by the time you reach the peaks you have climbed most of the way. The Tetons do not do that. They come up out of the valley floor in a single move, 7,000 feet of rock, jagged, grey, snow-loaded, standing there like something that was put down rather than grown. He came down into that valley in winter, on foot, alone, and looked at that. The valley is called Jackson Hole now. He is generally credited as the first person of European descent to enter it. The pass he likely used has his name on it. There is no record of what he thought. There is no journal. Nobody was there to ask. That is the second time tonight I've had to tell you that, and it will not be the last, and I am starting to think it is the actual subject of this story, rather than a limitation of it. The most extraordinary sights in the interior of North America were seen for the first time by someone from his world, by a man who did not write. He crossed the range, he kept going north, and then the ground began to behave incorrectly. I want to do this next part slowly, because I want you to arrive at it the way he did, without the thing you have that he did not, which is a word for it. You know what a geyser is. You've seen photographs. There's a national park with a visitor centre and a boardwalk and a schedule of eruption times, and the whole phenomenon is filed in your head under geology, a known category, a solved thing. Take that away. You're on foot in the middle of a mountain winter. Everything for weeks has been snow, rock, timber, and river ice. Cold is the entire environment, and it has been for months, and you come over a rise and the snow stops. There is bare ground in front of you in the middle of winter. Warm ground, steam rising off it in sheets. The snow has melted back in a ring, and the earth underneath is bare and stained in colours that do not belong in a winter landscape, yellows and rust reds and chalk whites. There are pools of water that are not frozen. Some are perfectly clear and impossibly blue, and you can see down into them further than seems reasonable, and they are hot. There is mud that is moving, not flowing, bubbling. Thick grey mud turning over on itself and popping, like something on a fire with nothing underneath it. The air smells as sulphur, which the human nose reads instantly as wrong, as rot, as something spoiled. And there is sound, not wind, hissing, deep intermittent thumping in the rock, a sort of respiration coming up through the ground you're standing on, and then, without warning, somewhere out in front of you, water comes out of the earth under enormous pressure and goes up, 20 feet, 50, higher, a white column of boiling water and steam standing up out of frozen country, and it holds there, roaring, and then it falls back and the ground swallows it. And the ground itself is not trustworthy. That is the part the photographs cannot give you. In thermal country, the crust over the hot water can be thin, inches, sometimes less, and it looks exactly like ordinary ground. It is pale and dry and it holds a footprint, right up until it does not. So you are moving through it slowly, testing, reading the colours, watching where the snow lies and where it refuses to. Snow is the only honest map you have out there. Where it sits, the ground is cold and safe. Where it has pulled back, something underneath is awake. Now, you are alone. Nobody has told you this exists. There is no word for it in your language that you have ever heard used about a real place. What do you write in your head? He had no framework at all, and the framework his culture did have for hot ground, sulphur in the air, boiling pools and roaring columns of steam was not geological. It was theological. Everyone in his world knew exactly one story about a place beneath the earth that was hot and stank of sulphur and roared, which is precisely why, when he described it later, the word people reach for was hell. Let me be exact about the geography, because this is where nearly every retelling goes wrong, and I promised you I would keep it straight. The thermal ground he described most vividly, the patch that got named Colter's Hell, was very probably the thermal area on the Shoshone River near where Cody, Wyoming stands today, a smaller and less famous set of features that has largely gone quiet since. That is where the nickname belongs. But his route, as best it can be reconstructed, also took him through country that is now inside Yellowstone National Park, where the largest concentration of geysers on the planet sits. He described thermal features in more than one place, and he almost certainly walked past some of the most spectacular geological activity on Earth in a season when nobody else was within 200 miles of it. Which parts did he actually see? In what order? How close did he get to the Great Basins? Nobody can tell you. And we're going to come back to why. Because the reason is one of the genuinely open questions in the history of the American West, and it is not for lack of people trying. He finished his circuit, he turned east, he walked back to the fort, and in the spring of 1808 he came in out of the snow and started talking. Picture the room, or rather the lack of one, a log post on a river junction, a handful of hard men who have spent the winter trapping and arguing and waiting, and Colter walks in after 4 or 5 months and tells them there is a place where the ground is hot in January, where mud boils by itself, where water comes out of the earth and stands up in the air. They did not believe him, and I want to be fair to them for a second, because it is easy to make them the villains of this, and they were not. Every one of those men had spent their working lives inside a trade that ran on stories. Trappers came out of the mountains all the time with things to say, about rivers that went the wrong way, about animals nobody had seen, about mountains of salt and valleys of glass. Some of it was true. Most of it was a man buying himself a drink with a story. That was the culture, and everyone in the room knew the game. So Colter walks in off a solo winter walk with no witnesses and describes ground that boils. Not all at once, and probably not viciously. These were not gentle men, and mockery was the standard currency. but they did not believe him, and what is far more important, the people they told did not believe him either, and the people those people told treated it as a joke. The story travelled down the Missouri to St. Louis and out into the world as exactly the thing it looked like, a trapper's tall tale. Men who had been alone in the mountains too long said things like this. Everyone knew that. It became a running gag with a name attached, and the name was Colter's Hell, and it was not a compliment. It meant the imaginary place that lunatic claims he found. Understand how the odds looked from the outside. A man goes alone into unmapped mountains for months. No witnesses. He comes back with a description that violates everything anyone knows about how ground behaves. Any reasonable person disbelieves him. The reasonable position was wrong, but it was reasonable, and it stayed wrong for a very long time. Colter died in 1813. The first official expedition to properly document Yellowstone's thermal basins and be taken seriously did not happen until 1870. Yellowstone became the world's first national park in 1872. 64 years. From the winter, Colter walked through that country to the year the United States decided it was so extraordinary, it had to be protected forever. He was more than half a century dead before the joke stopped being a joke. And in between, other men said the same thing and got the same treatment. Trappers came out of that country for decades describing boiling springs and exploding water, and for decades they were filed under the same heading. The mountains do things to men. That is the loop this story keeps closing. The most remarkable natural wonder on the continent was described accurately, repeatedly, for 60 years, by exactly the people nobody was inclined to believe. Now hold that, because we have a problem to deal with, and it is the reason we still cannot answer the simplest question about him. In 1810, John Colter walked into St. Louis and sat down with William Clark. Clark, his old captain, now Indian agent and the most important geographer in the United States, was assembling a master map of the West. He had his own data from the expedition, he had accounts from traders, and he had Colter, who had just spent 4 years walking through country no one else had seen. Colter described his routes. Clark drew them. When Clark's great map was published in 1814, Colter's wanderings were on it. There is a line across that map that exists solely because one man walked it, and then talked about it afterwards from memory. That map is the primary evidence for everything we have discussed tonight. And here is the problem. It is a map of a story. Colter had no compass readings, no instruments, no journal, no dated entries. He was reconstructing several months of winter travel from memory, possibly 2 or 3 years after the fact, describing it verbally to a man who then drew it at continental scale. Distances on it are approximate. Some features are placed in relationships that do not match the actual ground. Rivers connect in ways rivers do not connect. It is, by the standards of what came later, significantly distorted, which means that when historians try to answer the question, where exactly did John Colter go, they cannot agree. There have been serious, careful, competing reconstructions of that winter route for well over a century. Scholars have argued about which pass he used, whether he went north or south around a particular range, whether he entered the Yellowstone basins proper or only skirted them, and whether he made one long loop or two. The debate is still live. There is no settled answer, which is worth sitting with. We can tell you almost to the day where Lewis and Clark were during their entire journey, because they wrote everything down. For Colter, a man who probably saw more genuinely unknown country per mile than anyone else of his era, we have a line on somebody else's map and a nickname. And then there is the stone. In 1931, a farmer clearing a field near Teutonia, Idaho, turned up a piece of rhyolite roughly the shape of a head. Carved on one side, John Colter. On the other, 1808. It is now in a museum in Wyoming, and it is genuinely famous. It is also, almost certainly, not what people want it to be. The problems are straightforward and they are fatal. Nobody can establish where it was really found or under what circumstances. The carving cannot be dated. It surfaced more than a century after the fact, at exactly the moment when regional interest in Colter was peaking, which is the classic pattern for objects of this kind. And there is no plausible reason a man walking through hostile country in winter would spend hours carving his name into a rock. So it sits in a case being interesting, and it proves nothing. We have a distorted line, a discredited stone, and a nickname that got attached to the wrong valley. That is the entire physical record of the most extraordinary walk in American frontier history. But the summer after he came out of the mountains, something happened to him that people did believe. Every word of it. Spring 1808. He has come out of a 500-mile winter walk alive. He has been laughed at. He has done his job. What does he do next? He goes back up into the mountains to trap, not with a party of 50, in 2s and 3s, into the upper valleys of the Missouri, the Jefferson, the Madison, the Gallatin, which is some of the richest beaver country on earth, and also, at that exact moment, the most dangerous ground on the continent for a man doing what he was doing, because that country was Blackfeet country. I want to be careful and accurate here, because there is a lazy version of this that has done a lot of damage. The Blackfeet Nation was a major military and economic power on the northern plains, and their hostility to American trappers was not random, and was not savagery. It was policy, and it was rational. They had a functioning trade relationship running north to British posts. American trappers coming up from the south were not customers. They were competitors taking beaver directly out of Blackfeet territory without permission or payment. Worse, those Americans were arming and trading with the Crow and the Flathead, who were Blackfeet rivals. Every American in that valley was, in practical terms, a hostile supply line to an enemy. There was also blood in it already. On the way home in 1806, a small party led by Meriwether Lewis had a violent encounter with a group of Blackfeet men, and 2 of them were killed. That was the introduction. Everything after it was consequence. So the Blackfeet position was, in plain terms, stay out of our valleys, and it was enforced. Colter knew all of this. He was there. He knew men who had been shot at. He had, according to at least one account, already been wounded once in a fight while travelling with a Crow party. He went in anyway. And in the late summer of 1808 he was on the Jefferson Fork with another former member of the expedition, a man named John Potts, checking traps from a canoe at first light. They heard the sound of a great many people on the bank. "Let me tell you now how we know this story, because it matters," Colter told it. Out loud to at least 2 men who wrote it down. Thomas James, a trapper who worked alongside him, and John Bradbury, an English naturalist who travelled up the Missouri in 1811 and interviewed him directly. That is the whole provenance. 2 second-hand accounts written down some years later of a story told by the only surviving participant. I am telling you that at the front, before the drama, because I want you to weigh it honestly, this is not a document. It is testimony, and it is uncorroborated by anyone else alive. What follows is his account. They were in the canoe on the water at dawn when they heard movement along the bank. Potts thought it was buffalo. Colter did not. He had spent 5 years learning the difference between an animal moving and people moving, and he knew. Then several hundred Blackfeet men came out along both banks and signalled them to come in. Colter went in. There was nothing else to do. The canoe was in the open on a narrow river with people on both sides, and a canoe on open water is the worst possible place to be. He had perhaps 20 seconds to decide, and he decided correctly, and it did not help him at all. The moment he was ashore, he was seized and his rifle taken. Potts, still out on the water, refused to come in. There was an exchange. Potts was hit by an arrow. He fired his rifle and killed a man on the bank. That decided everything. Potts died there in the canoe. And John Colter was left standing on a riverbank, alone, disarmed, surrounded by several hundred people, one of whom had just been killed by his companion. He said afterwards that he expected to die immediately, and that he was fairly certain it would take a long time. They stripped him. Everything. Clothes, moccasins, all of it. He was left standing naked in the open. There was a discussion he could not follow. Then a chief came forward and asked him, through gesture and the few words available, whether he was a fast runner. Colter, and this is the single cleverest thing anybody does in this entire story, said no. He said he was a poor runner. He said he was slow. It was a lie. He had spent 5 years as a professional walker and hunter, and he was, by every account, extremely fast over ground. They walked him out onto the open plain 300 or 400 yards clear of everyone, and turned him to face the far distance and let him go. Then they came after him. He ran, naked, barefoot, on prickly pear and stone and dry grass, in high summer heat, with several hundred people behind him, and roughly 6 miles of open ground between him and the only cover in the landscape, the Madison River, ahead and to his left. He said he had never run like that and did not know a body could. The pursuit strung out behind him almost immediately, which is what happens in any long chase, the fast separate from the rest. After a mile or two, the crowd behind him had become a line, and the line had a front, and the front was one man with a spear who was gaining. Understand what 6 miles at a dead sprint does. A trained runner covers 6 miles at a hard pace and finishes wrecked, in shoes, on a flat surface, with water waiting. He was doing it barefoot on ground that is actively hostile to bare skin. Prickly pear grows low and flat, and you cannot see it in dry grass until it is in you. And every stride was landing on stone and thorn, and he could not slow down for any of it. And he could not look back. Turning your head costs speed and balance. So for miles he had no information at all about how close it was, except sound. Colter's nose began to bleed heavily from the effort. He said the blood ran down his chest and front as he ran. Halfway across he heard the footsteps close behind him, and he stopped. He turned around and faced the man. That is the moment the whole thing turns on, and it is not a heroic flourish. It is a calculation. He knew he could not outrun a spear thrown into his back. He was covered in blood, naked, and had stopped dead in the middle of a plain. Whatever the pursuing man expected, it was not that. There was a struggle. The pursuer was killed with his own weapon. Colter took the spear and kept running. He reached the river with the rest of the pursuit strung out behind him, went into the water, and swam for a raft of driftwood piled against an island, a jam of timber and branches sitting in the current. He went under it and came up inside the tangle, with the wood above his head and the water at his chin. And there he stayed. They searched. He listened to them go along the banks and out onto the driftwood pile itself, above him, close enough to hear their footsteps on the timber and their voices. He did not move for the rest of the day. After dark he came out of the water, swam downstream a distance, got out and started walking. Here is his position when he climbs out of that river in the dark. He is naked, he has no shoes, he has no rifle, no knife, no blanket, no fire kit. He has a spear he took from a man he killed. His feet are already destroyed from 6 miles of running on cactus and stone. His nose is broken or badly injured. He's somewhere on the Jefferson or Madison Fork. Fort Raymond, the nearest place with a roof and a door, is roughly 200 miles away. He walked it. 11 days by his account. 200 miles of open plain and river bottom, barefoot with no clothing at all, sleeping without cover, in country where he had to assume he was still being looked for. He ate roots. The one he named was a plant the trappers called breadroot, a prairie tuber you dig out of the ground with your hands, which he would have known about from 5 years of watching what other people ate. It is edible. It is not enough for 11 days. Think about what the sun alone does to a naked man on an open plain for 11 days in August. Think about the feet, not as an injury but as a daily problem, every step from the first mile to the last, with no chance of them getting better because you cannot stop. Think about the nights, when the temperature on a high plain drops 30 or 40 degrees after dark, with no fire, no blanket, no clothes. And think about the arithmetic of it. 200 miles in 11 days is roughly 18 miles a day. Barefoot, starving. That is not survival. That is a pace. And there is one more thing in that walk that almost never gets said out loud. He had just watched John Potts die about 6 feet away from him. Potts was not a stranger. He had been on the expedition too. They had crossed the continent together and come back, and both of them had chosen, for whatever reason, to return to this country instead of going home to be ordinary. So for 11 days, on top of the feet and the sun and the hunger, John Colter was walking alone with that. No one to say it to, nothing to do with it, just the ground going by and the same morning arriving again. He walked into Fort Raymond 11 days after the run. The men at the post did not recognize him. That detail comes down through more than one account, and it is the one that gets me. They looked at the naked, burnt, starved, bleeding thing at the gate and did not know who it was and had to be told. He recovered. It took time, but he was 34 and had the constitution of a man who'd walked 8,000 miles for a living. The feet would have been the long part. Feet that have run 6 miles on cactus and then walked 200 more with nothing on them do not simply mend. He would have been off them for weeks, in a log room, in a fort in the middle of nowhere, with nothing to do but wait and think. Which gives him something he had not had in years, and which nobody in this story ever gets much of, time to consider his options. And now we arrive at the actual mystery of John Colter, and it is not the geysers, and it is not the run. He went back, not once. That is the thing I cannot get past. Within a short time of walking naked into Fort Raymond, John Colter went back up into the same valleys. He went back to retrieve traps he'd left on the Jefferson, traps worth some money, in the exact stretch of river where his partner had been killed and he had been stripped and hunted. He went at night, moving in the dark, and he was found again, and he escaped again, and he came out again. And then he went back a third time. In the spring of 1810, he was part of a party building a new post at Three Forks, right in the heart of that country. It was attacked. Men were killed. And that finally was the end of it. There is an account, told second-hand, so hold it loosely, that he made something like a vow at that point, that he said if God would forgive him and let him out of this country, he would never come back to it. He got out. He kept the promise. He never went west again. But I want to stay on the pattern before we let him go, because the pattern is the whole story and nobody has ever explained it. Count them. 1. 60 days from home, he gets off the boat and goes back up. 2. Within reach of St. Louis with a canoe under him, He turns around and goes back up with Lisa. 3. After a 500-mile winter walk and a season of being laughed at, he goes back into Blackfeet country to trap. 4. After the run, naked, hunted, 200 miles barefoot, he goes back for his traps. 5. After that, he goes back a third time to build a post. 5 times. 5 separate, deliberate, informed decisions to walk back into the thing that had nearly killed him, made by a man who had complete information about exactly how bad it was. And notice the shape of it, because the shape is the argument. It was not one grand refusal to go home. It was the same small refusal, over and over, spread across 4 years, each time in a different set of circumstances, each time after fresh evidence that it was a bad idea. That is not a mood. A mood does not survive being stripped naked and hunted across a plain. That is something with a flaw under it, and not one word of explanation. Not in any letter. Not in either of the accounts by men who sat with him and got the whole story of the run out of him in detail. Bradbury interviewed him. James worked beside him. Neither of them ever recorded him saying why. I said earlier that his silence was going to matter, and here is where it lands. Everything we know about John Colter is a description of what he did. Nothing we have is a description of what he wanted. He is, in that sense, the opposite of almost every famous figure of that era. The expedition captains wrote hundreds of thousands of words. Politicians left correspondence. Even minor traders left ledgers with grievances in the margins. Colter left a route on somebody else's map, a story told out loud twice, and a signature. So the honest answer to why did he keep going back is that we can describe the behavior with confidence, and we cannot get inside it at all. Anyone who tells you they know is filling the silence with themselves. What I will say is this: whatever it was not recklessness. A reckless man does not survive 500 miles of winter alone or walk 200 miles barefoot. It was not ignorance, because he had better information than anyone alive, and it was not in the end permanent, because he did stop, and when he stopped, he did something that makes the whole thing stranger, not simpler. He came down the Missouri in the spring of 1810. He is 36 years old. He has been in the West continuously for close to 7 years. He is at that moment one of the most experienced men on the continent, and almost nobody knows his name. He goes to St. Louis. He sits with William Clark and gives him the geography, which becomes the line on the 1814 map. He collects some pay he is owed. And then John Colter buys a farm. He settled near Dundee in Missouri, on the Charrette Creek country, not far as it happens from where Daniel Boone was living out his own last years. He married a woman named Sally. They had a son. Read that back after everything you've just heard. The man who twice turned around within sight of home, who went back 5 times into country that was actively trying to kill him, ended up with a wife, a boy, a plot of ground, and a fence. He was there about 3 years. In 1812, the war with Britain came, and Colter enlisted in a ranger company. He served briefly under Nathan Boone, Daniel Boone's son, riding patrols in Missouri. It is a small, quiet, unremarkable end to a military record. He came home from that, and in the spring of 1813 he got sick. Jaundice, by the most commonly cited account. He died at home. He was about 38 or 39 years old. We do not have the exact date. We have the year, and a probate record, and a widow, and a small boy. His wife Sally did not long outlive him. His son was raised by others. There is no line of descendants keeping his memory, no family archive, no bundle of letters in an attic waiting to be found. Let me put the arithmetic in front of you because it is stark. He had roughly 4 years of the life we've spent tonight describing, 1806 to 1810. He got 3 years of the farm and then it was over. Everything in this story, the winter walk, the boiling ground, the run, the 11 days, 5 separate returns into hostile country, happened to a man who did not live to 40. And now the last open question, which is a strange one to end on, and I think the right one. We do not know where he is buried. There is a tradition, long-standing, locally believed, never proven, that he was buried on a bluff above the Missouri near Dundee, on a rise that later became known as Tunnel Hill. And there is a second part to the tradition, which is that in the 1920s, when a railroad was cut through that hill, the workmen went straight through the burial ground and what was in it was scattered into the fill. Nobody can confirm it. There is no marker. There is no verified site. There have been searches. There is a memorial, but a memorial is not a grave. And it fits so neatly with everything else that it almost feels arranged. No portrait, so we cannot see his face. No journal, so we cannot hear his voice. A route we cannot retrace. A relic we cannot authenticate. A famous story that survives only because 2 other men happened to write down what he said out loud. Every single channel by which a person normally reaches us is closed in his case. What comes through instead is behavior, where he went, and how many times, and what he did when it went wrong. That is the whole signal. So, the man whose route cannot be reconstructed, whose most famous story survives only as testimony, whose one physical relic is almost certainly fake, is also, in the most literal way, lost. And meanwhile, 64 years after his death, the ground he described became the first national park on Earth. Yellowstone gets millions of visitors a year now. There are boardwalks over the thermal basins and rangers who explain the geology and a schedule on a board telling you when the water is going to come up. Families stand at the rail with coffee and wait for it. Almost none of them have heard his name. That is not an injustice exactly. Nobody engineered it. It is just what happens. The first person to see something is rarely the person who gets to define it, and the man who cannot write is at a permanent disadvantage against the men who can. But it does produce one final quiet fact that I find genuinely hard to shake. The place he was mocked for describing is now so precious that an entire nation decided it must never be touched. And he never knew. He died in a Missouri farmhouse 18 years before anybody went back to check. Still, as far as the world was concerned, a man who had told a story about a hell that did not exist. Let your breathing slow now. We are nearly at the end of the walk. I have been turning this over the whole way through, and I want to leave you with what I think this story is actually about, and it is not exploration. It is about the gap between seeing something and being able to prove it. John Colter's entire life sits in that gap. He walked into the most spectacular geological country on the continent and came out with nothing but his own word, and his own word was not enough. Not because he lied. He did not lie about a single thing we have ever been able to check, but because he was one man with no instrument, no witness, no page. And the thing that makes it more than a sad story is that it did not stop him. He got laughed at in the spring and went back up into the mountains in the summer. He got hunted across a plain and went back for the traps. He lost his partner and went back to build a post. Whatever he was getting out of that country, it was not validation, because validation never came. Not in his lifetime. Not close. Most of us need to be believed. It is one of the deepest things people need. And here is a man who apparently did not require it in order to keep going, who was content, if that is the word, to know a true thing by himself. That is a strange kind of self-possession, and I do not entirely understand it. and it is the reason he has stayed in my head. There is one more thing to hold, and then we will let it rest. He did not do any of it alone, whatever the legend says. He survived that winter because people took him in. Bands who owed him nothing, who had every reason to be wary of what he represented, fed a stranger who came out of the snow and let him sit by their fires and told him which way to go. Without that, the 500 miles are simply a place where a man dies in November and nobody ever knows. The nations of that country knew about the hot ground. Of course they did. They'd been living alongside it for thousands of years, and they had names for it and stories about it and reasons to go there and reasons to stay away. It was not undiscovered. It was not unknown. It was only unwritten in one particular language by one particular kind of man. So when we say John Colter found Yellowstone, what we really mean is something narrower and more honest. He was the first person from his world to walk into it, come out, and try to say so. And even that took 64 years to stick. The valley is still there tonight. The water still comes up out the rock on its own schedule, the way it did in the winter of 1807 when one man stood in the snow and watched it and had no word for what he was looking at. It will do it again tomorrow morning, whether anyone is at the rail or not. It was doing it for 10,000 years before he arrived, and it has not paused once since. He is out there too, somewhere under a hill above the Missouri, unmarked, in ground nobody can point to. Both of those things will still be true when you wake up. If this walk was good company tonight, a like costs you a second, and it is more or less how a slow story like this finds the next person. Subscribe and the next one turns up on its own. Another road, another life, another man or woman who saw something true and could not get a soul to believe it. And say hello down in the comments, where you are and what the hour is on your side of things. I go through them all and I like knowing who is out there. Now put it down. The fire is out. The pack is off. There are no more miles tonight. Good night.